Hello, everybody out there in Radio Land. Once again, you're listening to Media Ciphers, your main source in the Kalamazoo area for that working class news and all those updates. We have a very special guest on today's program. This will actually be kind of the third installment of our book club series, which, if you're new to it, it's when me and a community organizer, expert, somebody else like that community joins me to talk about a specific book. And this is actually first for the program because today we are actually joined by the author of this fantastic book that I came across. I was actually talking a little bit with Joshua here about how I found it's literally like mutual friends on Facebook. I said, "Oh, a book about American communism," and then I found the PDF, and it was I don't want to gas you up too much, but it may be one of my favorite pieces of like leftist history I've read since Hammer and Hoe. It's very good, very comprehensive, and it speaks so much to a lot of the questions that I think a lot of kind of left and communist organizers here in the imperial core currently have to deal with. So yeah, so we're joined by Dr. Joshua Morris, who is currently an instructor over at GVSU, just a little ways to the north of Kalamazoo here, and we're talking about your book, "The Many Worlds of American Communism." And before we really get into the deep discussion, just how are you doing this afternoon? Or more,
Oh,
yeah.
I'm doing quite fabulous. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. I always enjoy, first of all, talking about the history of American communism, but I also like making sure that people are trying to engage with the history and trying to learn more about it and spread the knowledge and spread the history. By the way, that is a very high bar to say that it is as good, or if not possibly better than Hammer and Hoe by Robin Kelly. That is a monumental piece of work that definitely does a good service in focusing on some of the real genuinely positive activities done by the CPUSA and its grassroots activists. So
Oh yeah, and I think like to really like specify, I think I usually have like a short list of like when I meet new people or interested in the history of the American communism or the left. I have a couple books in mind that yours is now in that very short list. So
oh
it's
well, I am
uh,
super honored by that.
all right. So with that, I just want to kind of start with more of a kind of just broader, more basic question before we really start digging into the book. But could you tell our audience like what inspired you to take this on as a project? And just I'm kind of curious about the bibliography or research aspect of it because as we're going to be having some follow-up questions that dive into this more specifically, but the challenges that are unique to researching the history of American communist movements, especially because a lot of that history has been very buried and as I've shared with my listeners over the years, there are emerging number of great sources about that history. But I was just really curious, what are some of the unique challenges when you are a historian approaching a subject that has very deliberately been buried by in a number of ways and by a number of very powerful entities?
That's a good question, and it's kind of multifaceted. So I'll try to answer it in the array in which you first laid it out. So what kind of got me into this research? What really drove me into it? A lot of it had to do with my undergraduate years at UCSB in Santa Barbara, and I studied under this professor named Nelson Lichtenstein. I'm not sure if he still teaches there, but he was like the big labor historian of the department. And he was very emphatic, like more than any other history teacher that I had ever like taken before, very emphatic about this idea that communists were horrible politicians, but they were the best organizers that the labor movement had ever seen. And he shows me this quote from like Frank Folsom where he says like the communists were the most employed people I ever met during the Great Depression. They were in on every single strike or eviction event that I had ever heard of, etc. Like, so they were on the scenes everywhere. And I'm like, well, why did I never hear about this before? And why are you emphasizing it so much while all of my American history professors aren't really mentioning anything about strikes or anything about like workers' movements or this split in the Socialist Party, etc. So it was kind of like the gap of information between what I was getting out of labor history and then traditional American history. Now, in terms of the challenges of researching this book, they were quite monumental. I mean, the first major challenge is getting through the historiography, just getting through the first, the second, and to a small extent, the third generation of historians who wrote on this topic. And reading through that is a drudge work. It's a lot like reading a history that was written by cousins that can't sit together at the dinner table. Like it's very, very hard to read what they're saying and look at it as objective history and not more of a like I'm trying to stab this other historian's like argument in the back or something like that. But once you can get through that, once you can get through the historiography, then you kind of see the bigger trends that are being explained by these groups. You see that they focus a lot on nationalism. They focus a lot on connections with Russia and the supposed patriotism and where that patriotism might lie, etc. And then next you have to go beyond what these historians focus on in terms of just party documents. You have to go look at memoirs. You have to go look at oral histories and autobiographies and material that was not really looked at by the first and second generations, mainly because they didn't have access to it. No one wanted to talk about what it was like to be a communist in the 1950s, the 60s, and the 70s. It's only by the mid to late 70s that you start to see people, write their autobiographies and get this story kind of taken down. And, you realize, or I started to realize as I'm going through this, there is a whole multitude of facets of groups that are all coming into this movement, and they all come from different backgrounds. And all these historians are trying to describe communists as like binary categories. Like you're a communist or you're an anti-communist. You're a party member or you're an ex-party member. There's never much room for a gray area in between. And that's really what I got frustrated with going through all this research. And it drove me to try and find an explanation for that, to either prove that, yeah, communists are just either blindly loyal dogmatists or just fools, or there's some more to the story there. And ultimately what I end up finding is, of course, there's more to the story there. So, I mean, the last big question that I realize anyone has to grapple with when it comes to researching this material, and this also has to do if you consider yourself a radical or someone on the radical left to this day, is were American communists Americans first, or were they communists first? And by that, I mean, do they have some level of fetishization of the state in which they're not able to really get rid of that like American identity? And I think that one of the hard pills that a lot of people are going to find when reading this is that is actually very true. There were a lot of American communists who were Americans first, and then they got into the ideology of communism, but that was not sufficient to destroy their patriotism in the American Republic.
Sorry, that's a really good point to bring up. Later on we'll kind of talk a little bit, maybe some compare and contrast with kind of modern leftist movements, but that is definitely kind of big difference you see. There's a lot more kind of rejection of the American project you see in the modern American left. There's a few exceptions, but I'm not getting to goofy internet stuff. Yeah. So with that, I wanted to let's talk about the CPUSA, and again, I think some of your book does a really good job of. It's like, yeah, a lot of histories I've read really focus on just like everybody being in orbit around the party, and I think you do a really good job of pointing out that there's a lot going on of just kind of culturally, people who are maybe like more involved with kind of loosely fellow travelers, that kind of stuff. And I really appreciate your history does a good job of parsing that out as well. So, but let's talk about the CPUSA. So that's the Communist Party of the USA, and especially from what I've read, it seems like the height of their kind of power and influence was around the years of the Great Depression. What were some of their biggest accomplishments during this era? And can you all also discuss who and how they had the most success recruiting, and how they contrasted with other progressive movements of that era? It's important for listeners to understand, at the same time, we've got more kind of syndicalist groups like the IWW active, Socialist Party of America is an active entity, many other groups. So yeah, if you could we kind of start with that question and work through it.
So it's funny. Your question actually kind of belies the purpose and the intent of the study, which is to say that it's not just the CPUSA. There's more groups that are contingent in this thing that we call American communism. You have the Trotskyites who are still around at this time. You have Cannon still around. You have Browder, who's kind of leading the party but isn't necessarily as popular as Foster. They're kind of keeping factionalism down. So I get the question, but I want to answer it by prefacing it and stating that I'm going to be more inclusive than just the CPUSA. The CPUSA as a political organization actually hit its peak in the middle of World War II. In the Depression era is when they saw their most broad levels of support. So there's an important distinction there. But if I were to give you a list of what I felt are the biggest accomplishments by American communists in this time period, it was one, awakening up the masses to the fact that they could demand relief from their local, state, and federal government in the early phases of the Depression. So like 1930 to 1932, going from the unemployment councils all the way to the Ford Hunger March in Detroit in 1932. So, that is a monumental achievement that if you are unaware, if you have taken American history courses up to this point and you have never been told that the communists were the ones responsible for basically telling Americans you should go out and demand relief from your local government, I'm telling you right now, that's the truth. That's what happened. So that's number one big accomplishment. Number two, I think that this is something that the CPUSA did specifically, and it was definitely a big debate in the world of like the Trotskyites and the Stalinists, etc. But the CPUSA certainly deserves some kind of credit for being the first major political party of the 20th century to put ending Jim Crow on the ballot for the presidency. I mean, those images of racism chains us both, and showing that we have to break the Jim Crow laws. Like, I don't think, you look at all the other political movements and campaigns at that time, nobody was really pointing to racism as being a problem, except for the communists. I think that is profoundly important to acknowledge and address. That and placing James Ford as the first African-American after Frederick Douglass into a nomination position for the executive office. There's another big monumental triumph there that even if they didn't win, it's still important to recognize what they were trying to do there. They were trying to tap in and wake people up and realize that this is possible. You can do this if you get enough momentum behind it. Three, it would be impossible to ignore the work that communist lawyers did in the Scottsboro Boys case and the case of Angelo Herndon in the early 1930s. I think a lot of people know of the Scottsboro Boys. I think it's impossible to take an American history course these days and not hear about the Scottsboro Boys. But what you usually don't hear is that the International Labor Defense, the law team that they chose willingly over the NAACP, or a bunch of communist lawyers. That certainly should be acknowledged and addressed. And Benjamin Davis's role in kind of pushing for legislation and the overturning of unconstitutional laws in states like Alabama and Georgia should definitely be recognized as a kind of early component to civil rights history in the United States. And then lastly, I'd say in terms of the labor world, it's impossible to also ignore the monumental effort of building the CIO and the United Auto Workers out of the Flint sit-down strike. The Flint sit-down strike, still to this day, is arguably one of the most radical efforts to create a union in American history. It is on par with the 1835 Philadelphia general strike, in which workers literally took control of their workplace. They seized control of factories, sealed off the doors, used the tunnels to connect them all together. That is one of the most militant examples of working class solidarity in American history. And it was organized largely by communists. Wyndham Mortimer is the representative for the UAW to the Flint workers. So, and he's a Communist Party member. So those would be the four big kind of accomplishments that if I were to, I mean, obviously, I think there's a multitude of accomplishments that the communists had done during this time, but I think those are the four most important ones. And I address every single one of them in my book. Now, the who's of all this are very multifaceted. So we could talk about party leaders, like I mentioned, James Ford. I mentioned William Foster, etc. And yeah, these figures were important to drawing attention to the party. But there's also the grassroots people, like I just mentioned, Wyndham Mortimer, who most people don't know of, but he's on the front lines of the Flint sit-down strike. You also had Dorothy Ray Healy and Luisa Moreno out in California organizing Mexican-American, mostly women cannery workers in an era where the AFL was like, why would we organize these unskilled women workers? Like, it's not our job to care about unskilled workers, etc. And Benjamin Davis, I kind of already mentioned him and the ILD in that, effort. And then finally you had women like Emma Tenayuka in San Antonio, Texas, leading the pecan sheller strike and then turning this labor strike into also a struggle against the racist Jim Crow laws of the city. So, I think that when you focus on party leaders in the who approach to their heyday, you sometimes miss out on the much more vibrant and I think more exciting story of these people down at the grassroots. What was the other part of your question here? I'm trying to remember. What other one did you bring up? Oh, what other progressive movements did they contrast with their kind of work with? I think that what's interesting about the 1930s, first of all, have you ever heard of the phrase the pan-socialist left?
Sorry, I had a meeting. Yes, maybe if you could kind of describe that or define that for the folks at home.
Okay, so the first time I ever came across this phrase was by Mark Bray, and he wrote the book, The Anti-Fascist Handbook. And he came to Wayne State when I was a PhD student there, and he had this kind of debate with the big Marxist professor of the school, Ronald Aronson. And the two were arguing over the legitimacy of being openly anti-fascist in kind of a militant and sometimes violent way. And Mark Bray starts this whole conversation off by talking about the history of anti-fascist movements and how they are all a component of what he referred to as the pan-socialist left. So he would say the Socialist Party, the industrial workers of the world, the Communist Party and all of its various variants and subsects and everything like that, the Workers' Party of the United States, and to a small extent, the Progressive Party after 1924, all of these make up the quote-unquote pan-socialist left. Everything that is left, well, from your guys' perspective, left of the Democratic Party and away from the centrist politics of the Republicans and Democrats. And I think that one of the reasons why we call the 1930s the heyday of American communism, which is the title of Harvey Clare's book, I believe it is. Yeah. One of the reasons why we call it that heyday is because we focus so much energy on the idea that communists are gaining popularity and they're gaining momentum at this period, when I think it's a little bit more proper to see it as the pan-socialist left as a whole is gaining a lot of momentum all throughout the 1930s. And so as the Progressive Party, as the Socialist Party, rises up in popularity during this time period, you're also going to see that with the CPUSA. One thing that a lot of leftists love to point out is that the CPUSA got, 32-something thousand votes in the 1932 election. They're like, this was monumental for the party at this time. It's like, yeah, that's true. It is great. But Norman Thomas got over 160-something thousand. So let's not also forget that the Socialist Party is still there, also netting more votes overall and still taking part in this broad movement. So when we contrast the CPUSA from these other progressive groups, I think it's important to note that party leaders definitely compared or cared about those comparisons and contrasts. Grassroots members, at least from the research that I found, don't care at all. For the most part, they care about who's getting something done. You know, if the Wobblies are in Detroit getting, well, I mean, they weren't in Detroit getting something done, but let's just say it wasn't the Detroit Unemployment Council or the Detroit CPUSA. It was the Wobblies who were succeeding at organizing Flint and Ford Motor Company between 37 and 42. The communists certainly would have worked with them in the same way that they flipped around and worked with whoever they could in Toledo, Gastonia, Passaic, you know, all these other times the communists are used to kind of giving into this cooperative nature. So I think, I guess the long or the short way of saying what I'm trying to get at here is the distinctions between progressives in the 1930s are not as important as the fact that they actually did work together significantly for some pretty big gains.
Thank you. And I think like that, especially Uh, you know, in the next year, we're going to kind of move up a little bit forward in history, and I might leave the questions about the specific to the Popular Front a little bit further on because I think that's kind of maybe a little bit of a deeper discussion there. But yeah, I think it is important to note like it's like there was just this very broad base of militant organizing on the left going on at that time that there's a reason I think so many socialists and communists and anarchists kind of zoom in on that chunk of history. So kind of moving forward a little bit. So in the second chapter of your book, you focus a lot on the relationship between American communism, populist politics, the fight against fascism leading up to World War II. And I kind of, I wanted to ask, especially because if you're listening to this and all of this is new to you in particular, I think like a lot of us who've grown up, the Cold War hangover, communism is this innately foreign thing. It exists primarily in Russia, etc. So maybe talk to the listeners a bit about how American communists navigated their political scene differently than communists, say, in Europe or in Asia might have. I think it's kind of important to ferret out. It's like what specifically was unique about communist organizing and communist projects here in the so-called United States.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, especially in terms of understanding what I would call the uniqueness, while at the same time not superficial uniqueness of American communism. You mentioned that communism is usually depicted as foreign and whatnot, and that's actually the narrative that a lot of the first generation historians use to say this is why you'd have to be crazy to be part of this movement because it is inherently attached to foreign groups. Now, to get at why American communists function differently from European communists, I think they did so because they had to by method. There's actually even a document in 1935 that came straight from Moscow, right out of Stalin's desk, where he says, to quote, avoid the schematic applications of revolutionary methods in Russia in your home country. Basically saying like stop trying to like look at what we're doing in Russia and build that in the United States or in Germany or wherever, because you need to look at what your working class is struggling with, not what the working class of Russia is struggling with or another country. You need to be dealing with your groups of people here. Now, European communists were faced with a situation totally different from American communists. They were running elections. The Communist Party of Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, all these were like pretty big third parties to the dominant political organizations of those nations. The Communist Party of Germany was the second like big runner-up. So, and then you had them like squaring off with the Nazis. Now, that scene in which communists have such levels of popularity where they are on the electoral boards getting damn near 40 to 45% support, that's not going on here in the United States. That's, the CPUSA and whatever fringe organization that we could consider to be parallel to the Nazis, like the German American Bund or the KKK. These organizations are on the sidelines of mainstream American politics. I mean, they caught a lot of attention, yes, in the 1920s and 30s, but I don't think we could ever look back at that time period and say, here's a moment where the KKK could have secured the presidency. I don't think that that's palpable. So the conditions were fundamentally different. Now, on the issue of the Popular Front and why that meant American communists had to approach organizing methods slightly differently here, it is important to note that the adoption of the Popular Front is done by Moscow. It's pretty much endorsed by the Comintern and then instructed onto all of its localized elements. But the strategy itself had support among domestic rank and file communists as early as like 1931, when they were running into problems with dual unionism. The activists in the labor and the community worlds, they saw this Popular Front conceptualization as the logical evolution of labor organizing. Like, we're running into barriers between 31 to 35, so maybe we need to change our methods a little bit. And then Moscow comes out with this directive of the Popular Front, and they're like, there's where it all makes sense. So I think that what's interesting about American communists is we sometimes like to think that they are just blindly following Moscow, when at certain times, and 1935 is a great example of this, Moscow comes out with a directive, and Americans over here are kind of already like, yeah, we were kind of already thinking that. So that's a good idea. Let's go with that strategy. And party leaders are like, well, Moscow supports it and our grassroots base support it. So we're going to embrace this full throat. And that is ultimately how the Popular Front comes to be. And I actually, on this bit, I did quote something from my book on this. Page 282, I say, like the political world, communists active in labor organizing found little difficulty adapting to the Popular Front line after 1934. In fact, many who helped in key strikes throughout the early 1930s developed an understanding of cooperative organizing strategies long before they were brought up by party leaders. So, if you go and look at these memoirs and these testimonies, and even to a small extent, the Daily Worker, you will see grassroots communists saying, hey, maybe we should reach out to the Socialist Party. Hey, maybe we should push a policy of Social Security and not do it through the vestige of the CPUSA, but rather go get some Democratic Party senator to push it, which is exactly how they get HR 3895 or whatever into the Senate floor. So that, I think, is an important distinction that European communists never really dealt with. European communists enjoyed levels of support going into the 1930s that allowed them to push radical politics right at the ballot box. American communists, not so much. Does that kind of answer your question in terms of the distinction there?
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually something we talk about on our show quite often. It's like the whole idea that what is considered left in America is really different than what's considered left everywhere else, and that yes, you do see actual like socialist and communist parties, even contemporarily run competitively, especially compared to the American scene, which has typically been much more underground. And uh, so I think I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because we're talking about the Popular Front, and I had some kind of deeper dive questions about it. And so first of all, just for those who are maybe new to this history, if we could just kind of describe what the Popular Front was, and then I'm kind of bounce from there and talk about basically just what key lessons maybe we should take from it, but. Just for context, we're talking about the Popular Front. This is like the World War II era, talking about kind of this coalition, if you will. But I don't know, Josh, if you could maybe just describe that a little bit more specifically for listeners at home.
Sure. So the Popular Front actually really begins, if you really want to be ironclad about it, it technically begins with the directive by the Soviet Union and the Comintern to engage with more broad organizing strategies. And this document comes out in the fall of 35, and it becomes the basis for the CPUSA's 1936 presidential bid, which probably confused a lot more of its members than they intended. but the general line of the party in 1936 was do not vote for, I think his name was Alf Landon, and vote for Roosevelt. Do not vote for us either. Vote for Roosevelt. So that was the first time they really took this lesser of two evil thesis and put it right on their own campaign policies. So that's kind of really where it begins, and where it gets a lot of legitimacy in the labor and community worlds comes from the success of the Flint sit-down strike. With the Flint sit-down strike and the ability to work with what became the CIO, and then organize across different groups and organizational lines, that required grassroots communists to work with progressives. They couldn't have done it by themselves. The progressives wouldn't have worked with them otherwise. They would have just said, forget you, I can, just go and try and talk to your workers and get them on my side. So communists at the grassroots were smart to work with other groups innately. It becomes a little bit more of a complicated issue once the war actually really becomes, on. So I like to think of World War II as not strictly like beginning in September of 39 and ending strictly in the springtime of 45. I like to think of it as a series of phases. So the first phase is the Spanish Civil War, in which you have fascist forces taking over Spain, and you have Americans, not just communists, you have American liberals, libertarians, Democrats, socialists, anarchists, etc., pleading to the president, get involved in this war. You need to stop this. This is the overthrow of a democratic institution. Like, how can you not back this? But Roosevelt pledges neutrality. The CPUSA is kind of on the fence about, well, publicly we want to be pro-neutrality, but we also don't want to support fascism. So, publicly the party doesn't really do much, but members do go and join the Abraham Lincoln brigades and go participate in this huge fight. So there's the big first phase of the war. And I think the Popular Front mentality was, filtered into the Spanish Civil War because they were not fighting for communist forces against fascist forces. The communists were helping Republicans fight against fascists in Spain to restore the Republic of Spain. So right there is an example in the wartime front of an example of a Popular Front strategy, communists working with non-communists for the purpose of defeating fascism. And then the second phase of the war happens when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or the Nazi-Soviet Pact, gets unveiled to the world. And then all of a sudden, American communists throw their hands up in the air and they're like, oh my God, now what? Now we have to advocate against war and advocate peace with the Nazis. And you see a huge drop-off in membership of the CPUSA between September of 39 and the springtime of 41. And there's where the Popular Front really gets its kind of sticky nature and its highly questionable criticism by activists both then and now. And I'd say that, still to this day, it's pretty appropriate to criticize the messiness that comes out of it. Because by the time we get to the spring of 1941 and Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa to invade the Soviet Union, the Communist Party turns around and says, now this is a war to defeat fascism. We have to defend the socialist motherland, etc. And you have this period where people outside the party are looking at American communists going like, what are you guys doing? Like, you guys are flip-flopping back and forth. Like, at one point you're pro working with progressives, another time you're like, no, we can't work with progressives because they're advocating war. And now you're pro-war because the Soviet Union got backstabbed. It turned so many people off that they just didn't even want to listen to the communists anymore. Moving forward slightly, we get to the point where communists are arguing for the no strike pledge. The no strike pledge gets pushed by the Democratic Party in late 1941 after the Pearl Harbor incident. And very quickly, you have workers out in California at an aviation factory kind of test this limit and say like, well, we're going to walk off the job. And there's like 4,000 aviation workers that walk off the job. And communists in California support this. They're like, yes, this is good. We can use the context of the war to get big gains. But then Michigan communists, New York communists, Chicago communists, the party leaders, and the Roosevelt administration all condemn this walkout, and they support Roosevelt's deployment of federal troops to end the strike. And this is in, I think, late December or early January, late December of 41, early January of 42. I can't remember the exact date of it, but there's a good example of the complexity of the Popular Front there. Grassroots communists supporting this challenge to the no strike pledge, and then the national leadership saying, you guys shouldn't be doing this, yada, yada, yada. So the Popular Front then continues to wane between 1942, 43, 44, to the extent that you have a lot of radicals involved in the unions saying we should not be supporting the strike pledge. But the leadership of the unions recognize there's too much at stake if we give this up. The federal government could come down after us if we try to, shut down the Ford Motor Company, etc. So, it reaches a breaking point, and then people either decide consciously, fine, I'm just going to accept this and deal with it until the end of the war, or they break and they stop participating in party activities. They sometimes break with the union. Maybe they go and try to build a rival dual union. It usually does not succeed in any sort of a way, but they nevertheless will kind of break from the party. And you see this happen by like January of 44. The peak membership of the party is between November of 43 and January of 44. After January of 44, it just spirals downward, because this argument of maintaining the no strike pledge, when people are visibly seeing the effects of the war go more and more in favor of our side, they're like, why can't we use a strike right now to gain advantages in the workplace? But the party leaders and union leaders are holding back the reins and saying, no, we can't do this. And I think that's where a lot of the valid flack against the Popular Front comes. Where I don't think some people, or what I don't think some people consider, is that there are also a lot of communists who were supportive of the no strike pledge and were very passionate about fighting in World War II and winning that war, and not trying to do something like use the war as a context for labor and political gains back home. I interviewed 2 individuals who fought in World War II, and I've read 3 autobiographies of individuals who fought in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and in the war itself, and then also in both the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and the war. So, and these individuals, when you talk to them, they don't sound like communists. They sound like a patriotic military person that you might find to this day, talking about respecting the flag and respecting the national anthem, but nevertheless also saying, and I'm a proud Communist Party member. And it's not understanding that complexity that I think a lot of people get hung up on when they look at the Popular Front, and they say like, well, these communists weren't quote unquote doing things right, or they weren't doing things quote unquote radical enough. Well, if you go and you look at the party's membership, those who actually stayed with the party and did not abandon it during this period, they're far different communists than you might expect. They're communists that are also patriotic to the American system. They're communists who do not necessarily believe that theory is the answer to everything, or that if theory is the answer to everything, that theory should be adaptable and should evolve based on the moment and not be structured and rigid, etc.
Oh yeah, thank you so much, Joshua. And we're gonna dig just a little bit more into this because the I think you really fleshed out too, like the pluses, the negatives of the Popular Front strategy, and I think it's something that the pan-socialist left should look at really closely these days. We're emerging into one of those. Well, we have been in one of these periods, last half decade or so. We're really seeing the reemergence of militant leftism and militant international fascism. So looking at something like the Popular Front, I think is really important in an era where we've got fascist autocrats rising up. We've got brown shirts on our own American scene. As I often tell people, left-wing infighting is almost kind of like this cliche joke online, but
Yeah.
a proud boy is not going to quiz you on whether you're an anarchist or a Trotskyist or a socialist or whatever. So it's important to think about like what kind of how we built or how our predecessors were able to build that unity while also looking at some of the kind of negative or maybe errors that came out of it. I often recommend Black Bolshevik by Harry Haywood. But one thing that strikes me about these sort of popular front politics, especially towards the end of the war, was this idea of kind of a brokered peace between, socialists and liberal capitalists. And spoiler alert, that peace did not last. So,
Yeah, no, it
um,
did not.
so I was wondering if maybe you could talk about, like, especially what are some of the biggest lessons to take as modern organizers, as we are emerging, as mass fascism is rearing its ugly head once again in the 21st century, and particularly like what are some of the biggest errors and some of the biggest maybe like good lessons we should take from the Popular Front, thinking about that in our modern context.
So that's a pretty deep question. In terms of like how we can think about this for today, and you're definitely right in terms of we're entering another era of big unionism. I mean, there's a huge strike going on right now with actors in Hollywood that are driving the consciousness of everyday Americans into the idea of a labor strike in ways that it did not happen before. Like suddenly people are like, oh my gosh, Jack Black and my favorite actors and actresses from all those TV shows I like, they're all going on strike. Well, maybe I can do something like that. Like it's giving momentum. And then we have the Starbucks union, and we have numerous other efforts by the SEIU to try and organize unskilled workers, quote unquote unskilled workers. Looking back at this time, the real lessons to be learned here is that if you want to consider yourself a radical, okay, if you want to consider yourself a radical activist, you have to realize that organizing a movement that involves multiple points of action cannot be defined or explained in a simple way. You have to acknowledge that people who are coming into whatever left organization that you're trying to build, they likely all have different backgrounds. They all also likely have different expectations as to what to get out of this organization, and what that organization is going to mean for them for their lives. Sometimes, especially if you look at the 1930s and the 1940s, you will find that there are communists who, show up to their party meetings once a year. And then you'll find there are other communists in that same district who are showing up to party meetings every week. And then you'll find that there are party members who are constantly paying their party dues, and then others who are constantly paying catch-up dues and stuff like that. So people have different ways of valuing their input to the overall movement. And that's one of the first things that I think people need to really get over, is realizing that just because someone comes to your organization or comes to you and wants to work with you doesn't necessarily mean that they have your level of dedication and passion about it. They might have more, they might have less, or they might have equal, but nevertheless, it's not going to be as simple as you might think it is. And I think it's within those kind of very real and subtle differences that activists have about them that the problem of a social movement, factionalism and sectarianism, that's where they're rooted in. So in my first and second chapter of my book, I spend a lot of time talking about how these factions could not get over their hangups on certain issues that from our perspective today seem very petty, like whether or not to get involved in trade unions, what they should call their organization, when they should actually split from the SPA and form a communist party, whether or not they should be both a legal party and an underground party, and if these two different organizations are actually different or they're part of the same thing. It's such a meta debate that it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to us, but there's a reason for that, because that was all a mask for the real tension that was underneath it, which is that you had a minority of English speakers who were handed power by the Russians, while the mass majority of the movement is non-English speaking unskilled workers for the most part, many of them sharing cross connections in the IWW and various other organizations. So, if you don't acknowledge the real differences that are among the people that are coming to you into your movement, you are going to face factionalism at some point. And whether or not your organization succumbs to sectarianism and dies as a result of it depends on how you respond to factional elements. Most of the time, responding to factional elements by trying to kick people out or trying to force people to accept your way does nothing but turn people off, and it does nothing but make your movement smaller. So I think that's probably the biggest lesson. And the simple way of saying it is, don't try to think that you can go through a revolutionary movement in a simple way. The organization of Starbucks workers is being accomplished in a manner that requires a wholly unique and revolutionary new approach to a union, in which you go store to store, franchisee owner to franchisee owner. Like, that had never been done before. But if it's successful, it could lay the groundwork for unionizing McDonald's, Burger King, Subway, all the service industries, if it works. But it requires people to work together in a cooperative manner, despite having these different levels of input and different levels of perspective on the meaning of this overall movement. Let's see, is there another big lesson that I think is to get here? I just really want people to understand that the American communist movement, and any radical movement that still continues to linger on today, is a movement that is made up of people. And people are imperfect. People are not binary categories like I'm pro-communism, I'm anti-communism. Some people are, but there's a lot of people who are in the middle. They have a proclivity to communist politics and economics and philosophy, but maybe aren't educated enough into it or don't have enough experience into it to really call themselves a communist. But, you know, in the process of bringing people together, as long as you can both acknowledge differences while being inclusive of people into your organization, you can be successful. And I think by reading my book, you will definitely see the avenues that certain radicals took and how they failed, and how doing things like, let's just brush the fact that 2/3 of the party is non-English speaking under the rug and just hope that it works out, that doesn't work. That is a doomed strategy. And in many ways, it has nothing to do with Marxist politics. You know, Karl Marx never gave neither did Vladimir Lenin, does not give instructions on how to deal with, ethnic factional tension in your political party. They give suggestions on how to avoid factionalism, but not specifics on these grounded issues. So, you know, that I think is the big lesson that hopefully activists can get out of this, is to try and approach social movements with a more consciously inclusive mindset, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And, thank you for that elucidation. I think, something that kind of comes to mind is, yeah, being aware of, like, who constitutes the modern American working class. I think sometimes we do still see, it's a little bit of, I call it like this sort of Bruce Springsteen romanticism. It's like the working class is still all like people in small towns working in factories and such. And, again, where we're seeing the most militant organizing now are in these, service workers, Starbucks, Amazon, etc. So yeah, we need to, especially, I always tell people, like, if you're looking to really like radicalize people, think of the disgruntled McDonald's worker is probably more of a, or a hotel worker or such, is probably something you should look more closely at. So speaking of which, I think that was a really good segue into my next question, which is more specific to the relationship between like communist politics then and union organizing. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more, like, historically, what was entryism and dual unionism? How did they use those as strategies to radicalize the workforce? And, particularly, you just mentioned, Starbucks and whatnot. A lot of my listener base, and just a lot of, younger workers overall, in situations where they are present in workspaces where they are trying to kind of radicalize their coworkers, if not outright organize them. So, what are some of those lessons from those strategies that you think, modern workers can take about organizing and radicalizing one's workplace?
Yeah, that's a great question. And here's definitely where I think American communists have the biggest input into communist philosophy, which is this topic about entryism and dualism, because it's also the one area in which you see American communists give a pushback to Moscow and say, hey, wait a minute, I don't think you actually understand things. So entryism and dual unionism are broad categories to define organizational strategies on how to evolve, shift, or in some way change the direction of a particular organization slash movement. Now, you can have something like political entryism, such as I try to join the Democratic Party, right? And I join the Democratic Party with the purpose of trying to radicalize its local element, and then slowly, like a virus, spread throughout the party and then radicalize it into a revolutionary program. And then you can also have political dualism, which is generally how most of politics functions, which is I'm not going to go join the Democratic Party. I'm going to create a rival political organization and try to beat them in an election. Now, in my book, I focus on the more labor-oriented application of entryism and dual unionism. So the concepts date all the way back to like the 1880s, in which you had the kind of Prometheus of what we would call today the modern trade union, forming in Chicago and stockyards out of a group called the Knights of Labor. Now, the Knights of Labor believed that in order to build a union, you had to create these like shop floor nuclei. And that involved like having someone from the organization go get a job at this factory and then slowly spread the message of the Knights of Labor to all the factory workers. That's how the Haymarket riot actually occurs in 1886, is they spread it out factory to factory through a bunch of leaflets, and they speak in numerous languages to do so. So entryism starts off as this philosophy of just get inside of the factory or inside of the organization and then slowly radicalize it so you can get workers onto your side. And then the AFL comes into existence after the collapse of the Knights and the Organization of Federated Trades. And the AFL becomes kind of the biggest champion of the strike by the turn of the 20th century. But they have this very interesting policy, which is they do not, if you're going to create a union in, say, New York City for needle garment workers, there can only be one, and it can only be affiliated with the AFL. There's not allowed to be two different organizations rivaling for democratic power over a particular factory. And that's where the IWW then pops in. The Industrial Workers of the World pop up by 1905, and their chief existence is to challenge this idea of remaining solely in the AFL, and that's where dual unionism comes from. Rather than join the AFL, try to radicalize it, or try to work with the AFL's leadership, we're going to create a rival union, and we're going to literally try to build up an alternative and then let the workers decide for themselves. Now, entryism was also a tactic used in Europe around this time, and it was considered a pretty revolutionary strategy to break the craft unions that were kind of trying to hold back the tide of revolutionary change. And some of them, made comments about how it could work against the AFL. They said, well, if you can seize control of AFL locals, you can radicalize the workers. And since the national AFL only owes its existence to support from the locals, if you can slowly spread local to local to local, eventually the national AFL is going to have to change its mind. Now, of course, this is not how the leadership of the AFL, Samuel Gompers, views this. They view this as organizational sabotage. You're trying to destroy the union, etc. And that's oddly also what Lenin said. So Lenin comes out in 1917 or 1916 with left-wing communism, an infantile disorder. Actually, it might have been 1918. Either way, and the criticism was against entryism. And it basically says you shouldn't be just joining an organization with the intent of destroying it, with the intent of sabotaging its overall purpose. You need to be going into anywhere that there are workers. Now, if that means that the majority of firemen are in the AFL Firemen Union, then you need to go join the AFL Firemen Union. But if you find that there is like a workplace such as Passaic where there is no union, then build a union there. So Lenin kind of reorients the idea to be like, you need to evolve your strategies a little bit, and you can't succumb to thinking one way or the other. Otherwise, you're going to doom yourself into isolationism. Now, it's funny that William Foster is not a communist at this time when Lenin releases this pamphlet, but he is involved with the AFL, and he does have to deal with this moment in which the workers he's representing in the great 1919 steel strike are basically saying, we don't want to listen to the leadership of the AFL. We want to go to strike regardless of what Sam Gompers says. And so William Foster experiences the problems of being solely entryist or solely dual unionist way before he even read a single piece of Lenin, and way before he even traveled to Moscow to go, meet these individuals. And then also in 1919, when Lenin reads this instruction to John Reed, he unfortunately died in Russia and never made it back home after this, but he defiantly stood up and said, how dare you tell us to abandon the one major strategy that the IWW has been utilizing to try and break the AFL? We understand and we agree that perhaps it should be a little bit more of a balance between the two different strategies, but you can't sit there and tell me that I'm going to go home and instruct all these Americans who have been using dual unionism for the past 2 decades to just abandon that strategy. And it's that boldness, that kind of American defiance, that gains a lot of respect among Bukharin, Lenin, and numerous other leaders of the Comintern. And they basically go like, okay, we don't agree with you, but we respect your ability to kind of stand up and give us a philosophical retort. And that's why when John Reed dies, he gets like a 21-gun salute. He gets buried in a silver coffin. He's still sitting in the Kremlin. His body is still sitting in the Kremlin to this day. So there, I think, is what's kind of the most interesting thing about these two strategies. Now, moving into the mid-1920s, Passaic happens. Communists go in there. They build a union where there was none at all. The AFL comes in and basically says, you have to hand that union over to us, otherwise we're not going to legally represent the workers. The Communist Party says, fine, you can have the union. Now, I would ask anyone who considers themselves a philosopher of Marxism, is that entryism or is that dual unionism? I don't think it's either. I think that what the American communists had come up with by the early 1930s was a new perspective on labor organizing that I described as entryism when possible, dual unionism when necessary. So if it is possible to get inside of an AFL union, flip it, or perhaps radicalize it to get certain demands put forward, then do that. But if you're going to run into so many barriers that you can't get those demands put forward, then create an alternative union. And that's how, by 1936, American communists are some of the most flexible labor organizers across the United States. They're willing to sometimes entertain absolute party control over a strike. Other times, they're willing to listen to the AFL. Other times they're willing to listen to the Socialist Party and allow the Socialist Party to bring in its unemployment council to help them out. Why? Because they need bodies. They need people to help get this stuff going. So I hope that kind of helps explain entryism and dual unionism as philosophies, but they still remain very divisive concepts to this day. What I do hope that people can at least get out of the book is that I think the communists were right in that you don't have to be one or two. You can be both. You can apply these strategies based on the context of the moment. If entryism is going to work for Amazon workers, then let's do that. Let's support the Amazon union, even though it's not a radical Marxist-led union. Let's nevertheless support it because that's what the workers want. But if it gets to a point where the workers aren't liking the direction, they think the leadership is kind of being lackluster in their approach, then we should help them build an alternative. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And just getting people to like think a little bit about more about the modern context is again we're seeing more militant kind of workers just in general here in the U.S. we haven't really seen in a while, and some of these in some cases there's been kind of bucking against union leadership that's been a little bit more centrist for a number of decades. It's almost like to imagine being overwhelmed by people who are suddenly far more militant than you. And then we've also got, yeah, as you mentioned, Amazon, which people creating new unions and kind of plugging in to existing unions. But even those we're starting to see, I think of like, Smalls, and he's recently gone kind of solidarity trips to Cuba and stuff. We're starting to see this emergence of a more explicitly workers international kind of hard leftist thing in American unionizing. We haven't seen in a long time. And yeah, as you mentioned, it's important to look at what kind of happened historically when last time we saw these mass movements. So gonna pivot a little bit, and actually hold on just a sec. So the next thing I wanted to talk about with you, Josh. So your book was published out of Wayne State. And it's part of our show. We always try to, one of the goals of media ciphers is to take this kind of left working class lens and apply it to local issues. So, again, we're out of Kalamazoo, so like, what's going on when it comes to Kalamazoo capitalism, Kalamazoo workers movements, etc. Um, so. You spent a good amount of time referencing historical labor movements and actions here in the state of Michigan. And I was wondering if you could take some time to really kind of expand on that and talk about, kind of sketch out for our listeners some of that communist history particular to Michigan. And kind of if it helps kind of narrow it a little bit, how some of the workers' movements here in our state shaped shaped the state of Michigan up to here and now, and how maybe Michigan-based movements may have influenced other workers around the country.
So that's a great question. And to clarify, the book was published by Lexington Publishers. They're actually based out of Maryland, but I got my
Oh,
dissertation from Wayne State, which is where the basis of the book came from.
sorry.
But I
Correction.
can
I think like the version I got is an older. Yeah. All right. So we'll talk more about it. But yeah, sorry about that.
understandable. But yes, there definitely is a very rich history of American communist activity here in Michigan. I mean, first of all, the Michigan district of the SPA, which was led by this teacher, his name was Dennis Batt. They were one of the most radical districts of the nativist English-speaking contingent that broke away in 1919. In fact, they were the only mostly white English-speaking section to walk out with the language sections when that election of springtime got voided by the right-wing leadership of the party. Now, Dennis Batt would go on to lead the Proletarian Party after they eventually broke with the CPUSA in the mid 1920s. But he helped build this school called the Proletarian School of Detroit. And for a long time, from like 1917 through about 1924, if you were in Southeast Michigan, the only place that you could get access to the works of Marx and to a small extent Lenin was at this proletarian school. And so that I think is significant enough, is that, Michigan communists were among the first to kind of say, hey, we should set up these schools of thought where you could have a think tank library. They didn't even have that in the New York district of the party for the Socialist Party or the CPA after 1919. Now, when the language federations attempted to force Batt to kind of submit ownership of this proletarian school to the CPA in 1920, he refused and he walked out. And he's like, I'm not going to deal with this. And then he joined the United Communist Party when those factional elements kind of set aside their differences in 1921. And he also accepted the merger of the Workers' Party in December of 21. Batt led two party conventions that were both monumental in their significance. And both of them took place at the same location, Bridgman, Michigan. I've never been to Bridgman. I've kind of zoomed in on it on Google Maps to see what it looks like. It's kind of a small little town still to this day. It was back then as well. Now, there is a very interesting story about those conventions that I think is just waiting for some new researcher to go dive in and look a little bit more at. One of them drew the attention of civil liberty groups and a lot of lawyers after they heard about the sheriff arresting numerous Communist Party members and then walking them like a chain gang through the downtown area and then forcing them to stand outside in like full prison outfits in like 97-degree weather or something like that. It caught the attention of a lot of lawyers, and it got, I think, the governor of Michigan to basically tell the mayor of that city, like, you need to clean up whatever it is you're doing in your sheriff's department, because this is unacceptable. But Michigan communists made a lot of benchmarks elsewhere. I mean, let's not negate some of the biggest moments of the 1930s, such as the Ford Hunger March in 1932. The Ford Hunger March is significant because it drew numbers of people that vastly outnumbered the party's membership at the time. It vastly outnumbered a combination of the Socialist Party of Michigan and the Communist Party of Michigan. They get 10,000 people to show up on Woodward Avenue after 4 people are killed outside of the Ford Motor Company. That is a pretty powerful moment right there. The ability to rally a consensus against the tactics of a company in response to people just asking for relief. They were just asking for relief money, food, and jobs from the Ford Motor Company. And the response is 4 people get shot and killed. And so, that is a pretty monumental moment to get that many people to care beyond the ranks of the party. There's also, like I've mentioned numerous times in this discussion thus far, is the Flint sit-down strike, which is a revolutionary militant example of how you can succeed. For example, I mean, a lot of people don't realize how militant the Flint sit-down strike genuinely was. Imagine we apply that to the Amazon situation to this day. If you took the strategy of Flint and applied it to the Amazon workers would be around the country seizing the factories, locking the doors, and then sitting in them, not leaving until the concession is made, until the company agrees to the demands, period. In other words, they literally took the factories away from them. That is so radical. And I think today you would even see some people say, like, maybe you shouldn't be doing that. Maybe we should deploy the National Guard to stop this. And it would still be a debate today, even though it was successful in the past. Moving on from just labor gains and political gains, we also have 19 Michigan communists that I know by name who fought in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade against fascist Spanish forces in 1938 leading into 1939. One of them has become legendary. If you have not heard of John Yates and you have not read his book From Mississippi to Madrid, because he starts off in Mississippi, but he makes his way up into Detroit for a short period of time. He fought in the brigades for 6 months before returning home and helping secure numerous victories for the Republican forces. There's also over 120 nameable Michigan communists that fought in World War II, but the actual number of communists from Michigan who fought in the war is probably much higher. I think that a lot of people just weren't speaking up about their membership by that point, and largely because of the Nazi-Soviet pact and a few other things. I did interview one of them, and his story shows up in my book. But to give you probably a quick rundown of it, because I think his story is probably the best of what Michigan communists are really all about. And I can't tell you his name because he preferred to remain anonymous, but his name was Mr. M, and he fought against the Japanese, and he was put to task of organizing the All African American Army Engineer Corps. Now, at the time in World War II, the Army was segregated. And one of the aspects of segregation is that you would have a whole platoon of African American troops, but they would be led by a white officer. Well, this one guy, Mr. M, happened to be the officer put in charge of this entire platoon of engineers. And he fights in the war. He gets to know all of his troops. He becomes best friends with them, etc. And then they come back home and they face Jim Crow segregation the second they get into Tennessee. And he basically threatens to have all of his troop members destroy the shop unless they get their food and their meal tickets served. And then he comes back home and he joins the Communist Party, like right after that. So, I mean, I think that these individuals have such fascinating stories about them. And not all of them are strictly like born in Michigan, but at some point they come and they experience the Communist Party's inner workings here in Michigan. And Mr. M, he unfortunately died 2 years ago, but he spent the rest of his life a civil rights lawyer, fighting for African-American rights in and around Michigan. So yeah, there are some fabulous stories of true American heroes that come from Michigan communists.
Oh, thank you so much, Josh. That's some real pure Michigan right there. Quick side note for folks listening at home too. There's some really great resources on that, especially your book kind of ends towards the 50s and McCarthyism, but I also invite people, if you are really interested in this history of militant leftist organizing in the Michigan area. Detroit, I Do Mind Dying is an essential book talking about the League of Revolutionary Black Workers that really, it only in Detroit could you really married the sort of militant Black Panther style Black liberation politics with industrial unionism, which is kind of precisely what they and like Drum did. So yeah, if you want to kind of zoom in on that piece of history, that's also another bit of essential reading. Um, with that, I think the next thing I want to talk to you about, maybe kind of scope out from uh, talking about this very localized to Michigan question. Maybe talk a little bit more about the sorry, I was going to zoom on the question here. You've already mentioned some of it, talking through some of our other questions, but hitting on the relationship between the CPUSA and the Comintern. And something I find interesting about this is probably, for the typical young communist or socialist who was maybe born in the 80s and 90s, the idea of like an international communist thing that we have to either like listen to or take advice from is very alien. It does not it doesn't it's very different from our modern context. And I'm kind of curious, talking about how that relationship worked favorably and unfavorably for American communists. And I think there's definitely some lessons we can take there. I think we could do better as a pan-socialist left when it comes to internationalism, and there's maybe some lessons there. But also, yeah, it did lead to some really irksome contradictions. The I, Molotov Ribbentrop. I always slaughter that.
I
Max.
always just default to Nazi Soviet Pact.
The Nazi Soviet pact. Yeah. But again, it was very, as you mentioned, it's very confusing to a lot of people on the ground. But yeah, maybe explain that relationship and ways that it worked favorably and unfavorably for communists in America.
Yeah, so the relationship between the CPUSA and the Comintern, which for those of you who are unfamiliar stands for Third Communist International, can be viewed in many ways, but I think the simplest way to understand is that both entities viewed each other's existence as fundamentally different in purpose, and that's where there was a communicative breakdown. So if we were to consider this like a relationship between like a parent and a child, it is a relationship in which the child is viewing the parent as something way more important than the parent views themselves. So what do I mean by that? Let me kind of unpack this a little bit. So the CPUSA started its life off as two barely recognizable former Socialist Party organizations that were both just kind of begging the Russians for international recognition. And when they went to Russia, they weren't actually like showing the Comintern, like, here's all the gains that we have. Here's the potential that we have in elections. Here's how many people we have tapped into the unions. They weren't talking about that at all. They were talking about like, well, we were the first ones to decide to split from the C or the SPA, or we were the ones who came up with calling ourselves the Communist Party of America. And so the Russians and the Comintern, as an authoritative body, they look at this and they're like, okay, like we can give you guys some instructions and we can give you guys some ideas about how you should work together, but ultimately you guys need to come together, and we're not really going to help you out until you agree to come together. Now, that sounds very logical. It sounds pretty straightforward, but the two communist factions were so fetishized in their desire to be the one that got recognition from the Russians that they didn't actually really think about how to go ahead and unify together. They were more or less saying like, well, I want to be the one to reach out first. No, I want to be the one to reach out first. And if I reach out, then here are my demands. And that they would go back and forth. And so the Comintern looks at what's going on at the local level in the United States and is like, these people are in need of direction, but they look to us in a way that they should not be looking. And in fact, I shouldn't have used the analogy of a parent. I think it's a little bit more like an older brother. So the CPUSA viewed the Comintern as an authoritative body, like an older brother who's kind of been through the ropes so far, has done the whole revolution thing, knows what it's like, and we can learn from them a little bit. And I think this is also why this is a good analogy, because just like an older brother, does the older brother always tell the younger brother everything that they need to know? No. The older brother always withholds a little bit of information because they want to kind of keep things in their favor. That's precisely what the Comintern did with American communists. They did not necessarily view American communists as capable of rationalizing revolution in their manner. The Comintern certainly acted with authority, and they gave instructions as if they were like the sole body of authority, but that is not necessarily because that authority was real. It was because they knew the Americans would do it. They knew that the Americans would very much seek recognition from the Comintern and do whatever it takes to maintain that recognition, even if that sometimes means completely flip-flopping on political policies. And when the Russians saw this happen in 22, 24, 28, by 1932 to 1935, the Russians are looking at it like, we can tell the American communists to do whatever we want, and at the very least, the leadership will do it. The grassroots elements of the party might not follow the rules to the letter, but at least they're going to be filtered what the letter is by the Communist Party's leaders. Now, there are all exceptions to this that are very important to address. I already mentioned John Reed, standing up to Lenin and getting recognition. But there's also Claude McKay and James Ford, who argued that, Russian communists and the Comintern don't understand racial oppression in the United States, and that there's nothing that you can read from Marx or Lenin that is going to, give you the wisdom of fighting against racism in the United States. And they convinced the Russians. The Russians were like, you're damn right. We don't know. We agree with you. In both of those instances, John Reed and the African American section of the quote unquote American Negro Congress, the boldness to speak up and challenge the Russians was not met with ridicule like a lot of people thought. It was met with respect, and they gave recognition to these people. Outside of those exceptions, however, CPUSA leaders usually preferred to use the Comintern as like a rules lawyer, to use Dungeons and Dragons terminology there a little bit. But nevertheless, to say like, okay, here's the event, here's the thing that's going to happen. What do we do? Well, we're not going to decide ourselves. We're going to go to the Comintern and get directive from them. That's what American Communist Party leaders did. Now, that is not to say that grassroots and mid-level ranking party leaders felt the same. To give you a classic example, one of the great autobiographies of the first wave of communists who wanted to speak up was Peggy Dennis. And Peggy Dennis was, for a long time, married to a significant party leader. His name was Eugene. And she noted in 1928 that all the Communist Party's leaders went out to Moscow to go attend the Third Party Congress. And when they came back, there was a trifecta of organizations. There was the CPUSA, then there was the Trotskyite split away group, and then there was the militant split away group. And these three segments all claimed to be leading the Communist Party at the end of 1928. And Peggy Dennis noted how people at the grassroots did not understand this shuffle, that the Comintern told the party's leaders, we're giving this to Browder and Foster and taking it away from Cannon and all the other segmented groups. Peggy Dennis was like, we didn't understand that until a year later. Like, no one really explained the Comintern's directives to us. So grassroots members were, for the most part, aloof to these decisions. So, and in answering your question, what is the relationship between the party and the Comintern? It depends on what kind of a communist we're talking about. If we're talking about William Foster, he's probably got, in today's terminology, he's got the Comintern on speed dial. But if we're talking about Peggy Dennis, maybe she can talk to the Comintern through her husband, who then goes through another party leader. But if we're talking about the people who are organizing the United Auto Workers in Detroit, they both know they don't have a voice in the Comintern, and in many ways they don't care what the Comintern has to say. If the Comintern says something that they disagree with, they leave the party. And we see that happen in 32, 34, 36, 39, 41. So there's plenty of examples of grassroots people leaving the movement as a result of Comintern decisions, as opposed to the other way around. And then Comintern making a decision, and then suddenly mass recruitment shows up. That doesn't seem to happen in CPUSA history. It's the other way around. So the relationship is complex. And the relationship is ultimately the reason why certain party leaders get ousted. Like Browder gets ousted because the Comintern gets liquidated. And he's convinced that there's this new era of democratic politics, and we should just become the radical wing of the Democratic Party. Well, that doesn't work when the French communists speak up about this, and when William Z. Foster realizes, no, then we're going to lose all of our attachment in the labor movement. So there is a pushback against that, but the relationship is, I've always been difficult on trying to render whether or not the Comintern's relationship was more positive than it was negative. But I genuinely believe it was kind of a neutral balance of both. I think that the Comintern gave the American communist movement direction when it was necessary. They also fundamentally funded the entire movement. We can't get around the fact that the Moscow gold thesis is 100% true, and the USSR funded hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to try and keep things like the Flint sit-down strike going, the Gastonia strikes going, etc. So those are very positive impacts, even though some historians like to paint it as negative. But there are also negatives. I think it's impossible to deny that when the Comintern tells William Foster in 1924 to abandon working with the progressives, Eugene Debs said it perfectly. He's like, I'm sorry, I don't have a church in Moscow to tell me what to do. So there are times that the Russians use the fact that American leaders view them as the big brother into their favor, even if that favor is not working out for the best of American workers. Now, I know there are going to be people who disagree with me out there, because the suggestion there is that the Russian communists don't care about American workers as much as they care about their own political revolution. But yeah, I would certainly say that there's some degree of truth to that. The Russians, how else do you explain the Nazi-Soviet pact? I mean, there are certain elements of Soviet history that themselves are conundrums. And if we can acknowledge that, like, that certain actions and policies by the Soviet Union were anomalies in contrast to Marxist philosophy, then we can acknowledge that the relationship between American communists and the Comintern was both useful but not perfect. Does that make sense? Hopefully.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Josh. Thank you so much. And so this next question, we've already kind of gone over a lot of this in the course of our discussion. So I think I'm gonna try to make this a little more pointed. But again, boomeranging back to like localizing of communist politics. And I know you talk a lot about this in chapter 4, communism more as a cultural force. And what's interesting is you look back at the history and some of the places that have some of the strongest legacies don't necessarily have a ton in common. You talk about like industrial unions in Detroit or sharecroppers in Alabama, both of which had really like strong and robust communist movements at their times. And I was kind of curious, like what is kind of the common thread, the secret sauce, as it were, that and I think also kind of bucks against what we're kind of taught, propagandized growing up, that communism is this foreign thing. Um, what was some of the 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 most successful bits of like localizing that homegrown communism, and how that speaks to some of those historical misconceptions and often reactionary propaganda that communism is this foreign influence. I mean, we see this to this day, where there'll be a Black Lives Matter protest, and we get this narrative about outside agitators, and even we're seeing like the C word being invoked more now these days. But
Yeah. The links between the left of this time period and the left of today should be obvious to anyone who spends even a couple of days reading through this material. I very much believe that the nation both had and still has a very vibrant leftist movement to it. Even though some people say that it's declined or whatnot, I still think that it's in existence and it's around. And depending on where you are in the country, you're likely to find a very different type of communist at this particular time frame, that is the 1930s and the 1940s. But nevertheless, you're going to find one that is relegated to these worlds of experience. So there's the connecting thread. Hence, I get the title of my book. The one thing that all these multifaceted communists have together is that they all come from different backgrounds. And that is arguably the most important thing to really get. In California, for example, you had longshoremen workers who arguably were the most radicalized trade unions of the West Coast, and their connections and links to various other political networks were pretty vast. If you've seen the recent film Oppenheimer that just came out, you'd know that the lead character had an affair with a communist associated with the longshoremen union in San Francisco. And that is very much expressive of the kind of West Coast communal identity that communists had. For those communists who engaged almost exclusively with their community and not necessarily were involved in the labor union or the party itself, they lived a life that we would probably imagine any other typical American was leading, just with a little bit of a more edgy style to it. So take the Oppenheimer example again. The woman that he had an affair with in that movie and in real life fully knew that he was working with the national government on a top secret project involved in the war. Now, you would think today, why would a communist ever do that? Like, why would a communist go link up with some bootlicker, supportive of the national government and their effort to try and, wipe out segments of humanity? Well, the answer is that it's more complicated than that. You could be a communist, yet at the same time date an FBI informant. You could be a communist and still be involved in the Los Alamos project, just like we know Julius Rosenberg was, and David Greenglass, etc. But I think that in these instances, these individuals who are like living their lives out and associating with people that we would be like, why would you even be doing that? They don't look at it that way. They're not trying to complicate their lives and say, I need my identity as a communist to be a personality trait that defines every component of who I speak to and whatnot. No, these people are just living their lives. And, we have a lot of hang up just accepting that. Also out in California, you had individuals like Russell Brodeen, who I interviewed his son, but his father wrote a great book called Fiddle and Fight. He was organizing highly skilled musicians in the Los Angeles Philharmonic. Brodeen struggled to maintain cohesion outside of his academic circles, but he nevertheless built a community unit within the groups of people that he did associate with regularly. And that, I think, is what communists were doing en masse in their communities, is they were trying to just build connections and build personal relationships with one another, so much so that you could genuinely call someone a comrade and have that equate to a friend, not just, hey, you're part of the same political party as me, but hey, I could trust my life with you, or hey, I could trust my property with you, etc. Get on a level in which people see each other as genuine equals. Now, flip the scene and go all the way over here to Michigan, and you would be hard pressed to find communists who are involved in the community who are not also directly involved in the labor movement. And you are also going to find in Michigan communists who are willing to draw the line and say, no, you do not associate with those people. You do not go hang out with anyone who is on the Detroit Police Department, anyone who works for Harry Bennett and the Ford Motor Company's security force. You don't associate with those people. The Michigan Communist Party in like the late 30s and the early 40s is much like akin to Fight Club. Like, you just don't talk about the activities that are going on. But in California, they're just like, let's invite people over to all the party movements, even if it's just a picnic. Let's invite them over and kind of create this communal atmosphere among workers. Now, this is because geographically, Michigan, first of all, is a much more heavily labor-oriented state. We also see a similar paradigm play out in the South, where the conditions of the Jim Crow system make it impossible for communists to organize in like Georgia, Alabama, and Florida the way that they're organizing up in Michigan. You can't. Like, the laws literally prevent you from organizing in the same way. So whereas organizing in Michigan against the KKK is kind of like, it's likely to result in a riot, and it's likely to result in a lot of big demonstrations. Organizing sharecroppers in Alabama is likely to just get the KKK to show up at your door in the middle of the night with shotguns. So it was a totally different scene, based geographically where you were going. So I think that is the big important part of this kind of cultural aspect to being involved in the Communist Party. And I'm not the first person to acknowledge this. Michael Denning, who wrote about the Cultural Front, talks about this, significantly, that, communists were capable of tapping into communities through things like music, art, film, poetry, in ways that other activists were not actively trying. They were not trying to organize a poetry night where they sang songs about Marx and Lenin and overthrowing fascism, while also then planning to do a labor strike the next day, or planning to organize a resistance challenge to a KKK demonstration. That's what the communists were doing. And I think it's important to see this communal identity that they develop in terms of culture as a whole core as to what it means to be an American communist at that time. That's why I consider culture to be one of the worlds of American communism.
Thank you so much, Josh. I think again that we're being able to kind of you know examine those through lines is really important, especially even in the context we all have these different organizing situations that we're approaching, and it's more to see like kind of what these things have in common and what we can apply. Okay, so we're in the home stretch now. I really want to thank you so much taking all this time out of your day to talk to us on the show. But we're got like two or three questions left. And this, always this is the tragic part. We always get to we're going to talk a little bit about McCarthyism, and
Okay.
the last two chapters of your book really deal with the fragmenting of the Communist Party as a major political force in America. And you focus both on, their internal contradictions and the McCarthyist onslaught. And it's interesting you read, I'm going to reference Harry Haywood again. He had a lot of critiques about how he thought, communists should have stood up more against the state. They shouldn't have gone underground so quickly. Um, and I'm kind of curious, in your research, what do you think were some of the parties and like the pan-socialist left's mistakes in confronting McCarthyism? Um, how do you think that it factors into the historical erasure of the CPS USA as a political force? And before you answer that question, just real quick, and I know like people who listen to our show a lot are already aware of a lot of this context, but again, this is on our public radio station. So if you're just tuning in, context is McCarthyism really tried to salt the earth when it came to leftist organizing in the United States, and they were very successful. And further on in history, you saw it reemerges in the 60s, militant leftism. And you had like the Powell memo and the neoliberal backlash to that. And now you're seeing another reemergence here in the 2010s and going forward. So just important to stick out that like this was a really profound attack on the American left. Just want to kind of give the listeners that context they might not be super familiar with. But I wanted to kind of hem on like, what were some of the errors that the CPUSA and broader American communism did in addressing McCarthyism, and just kind of if you could parse out like what were the combination of those internal contradictions and McCarthyism itself that led to not only their decline as a political force, but also just the historical erasure of communism as a political force. Because I think we can't underscore enough how much, especially younger communists, how this history was very deliberately buried, and why books like this are important in kind of digging that back up.
Yeah, so this is in part a question that I certainly anticipated being one that people would find interesting and important, especially if you consider yourself a radical. If there was one thing that the first generation of American communist historians certainly got correct, in my opinion, it was that when that Comintern was dissolved in late 44 after the Tehran conference, American communist leaders had no idea whatsoever what to do next. It's just like that analogy of the brother. It's as if, like, the older brother somehow dies or somehow goes away, and now you're stuck to figure things out on your own. This was the fact that party leaders did not have any clue as to where to go was evident by the way Earl Browder, who was the chairman of the party at the time, tried to quickly dissolve the organization into the left wing of the Democrats. Now, once this was halted by a combination of local forces like William Foster and other members to try and resist it, but also the Communist Party of France coming out condemning the move by Browder as like a betrayal of the revolution. Once that's halted and the forces of Browder's kind of quote right opportunism were destroyed, the CPUSA made arguably its biggest philosophical blunder of all time. It claimed that fascism had come to the United States. And I think that in answering your question, what kind of mistakes did communists make in the McCarthy period? This is by far the biggest one. What is the basis of challenging democracy and suggesting that fascism already exists in 1946? I think it was the result of overthinking and overanalyzing the purpose and the intent of the Truman administration at the end of World War II. Now, first of all, the CPUSA still to this day has never rectified or commented on the fact that they supported some pretty bad policies in the middle of the war. This not only includes what we've kind of already mentioned before that has been very divisive in terms of the no strike pledge, but they also supported the use of the Smith Act against the Trotskyists in 1941. That's actually the first time that the Smith Act gets used. They all think it's going to be used against the KKK and the German-American Bund. Nope, it's used against one whole segment of the American communist movement, and you see the CPUSA support it. And then there's also the CPUSA's kind of nascent support of the use of the atomic bomb. They have never commented on this sort of stuff. And I think that's kind of a black stain on their overall kind of political movement coming out of World War II. But in terms of how they overestimated the Truman administration, they looked at things like the loyalty oaths and the demand by President Truman to have all federal employees swear an oath that they are loyal to the United States and are not members of the Communist Party. They heard that, and while I kind of understand their, I guess, knee-jerk reaction to it, they describe it as being no different from the quote-unquote Night of the Long Knives, in which the German Nazi Party kind of goes around and purges all the left-wing elements of the Social Democratic Party. This, more than anything else, drove grassroots party members away after 1946. People were like, what are you talking about? Fascism has come to America. We just fought fascism. Now, think about some of those individuals I mentioned before, like Mr. M, John Gates, John Yates, who go off and fight in the Abraham Lincoln Brigades. They go off and they fight the Japanese and the Germans in the war. And then they come home and their party is telling them, congratulations, you defeated fascism around the world, but now fascism has taken over the American Republic. These people were probably very much bewildered by what they were hearing coming out of their political organization. And the reason for why people left is quite simple, as put by James Yates. Quote, and this is me quoting James Yates actually, most people do not like hearing that by defeating fascism abroad, we had somehow brought it home. So when CPUSA leaders were put on trial in 1948 at the Foley Square trial of New York City, this is the first big trial of Communist Party leaders. They did not cite the First Amendment. They did not cite the Fifth Amendment nor the Sixth Amendment once, all of which probably would have squashed all the charges that were pushed against them. Instead, they tried to argue that fascism had come to the United States, that they would never see a fair trial, and they tried to also argue the, quote, wisdom of communist philosophy, particularly the inevitability of capitalism's downfall. They talk about things like the tendency for the profit rate to fall. They cite Das Kapital over and over and over again. In one particularly embarrassing episode, William Foster cites a section of Lenin's What Is to Be Done, and then what does the prosecution do? They go, look, this whole time we've been trying to tell you that these people are advocating overthrow of the government, and he just cited a book that literally says you have to overthrow the government to succeed. And it was just like that. And basically, the Communist Party leaders admitted to everything the prosecution was trying to get at them. They should have argued their First Amendment rights. They should have pleaded the Fifth every time they were asked a question about Lenin or overthrowing the government, anything like that. But they didn't do that approach. Their whole approach was to try and defend Marxism. That is a monumental mistake. Now, in terms of how do we apply that to today? I know that a lot of young revolutionaries, a lot of young radicals, they're getting very excited reading Marx or reading Lenin, reading, anarchists like Proudhon, etc. But you can't succumb to the idea or the fetishism that you can operate your movement outside the legal structures that are dominant in the world. So the First Amendment exists in our law system. And if you can use that to your advantage to try and challenge the system, why not? Like, why would you turn away from that? You should be using the Constitution to try and tear down capitalism if that is a successful path that can be done. So the communists didn't realize that. The communists didn't conceptualize the idea that the Constitution can actually help them advance their cause. This does become the case in the Michigan trial, the trial of the Michigan Six in 1951-52. Very famously, they try to tell this one lawyer, his name was Ernie Goodman, I believe. They try to tell him fascism has come to the United States. Look what happened in New York City. We're all going to face the exact same thing. And Ernie Goodman takes on this this case. And there's a great movie that was made by Wayne State called First Amendment on Trial, if you're interested in checking this out. And they have this great part of where they interview Ernie Goodman in like the 1970s. And he said, I looked these communists dead in the face and I said, my parents and I survived the Holocaust. And you're telling me that fascism has come to America? I will prove to you that the Constitution can defend your rights. And that's what they do in 1952. They plead the Fifth, they plead the First Amendment, and they managed to get the case pushed until 1957, and the Supreme Court kills it all. And the 57 decision of Yates v. United States in the Supreme Court, the whole basis of it was First Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment. So, I know that I'm kind of repeating myself slightly here, and I'm dwelling so much on the legal aspect, but activists today should not fall into the trap of thinking that you can argue outside the language of our current legal structures. The legal system and the courts that we have only understand your rights as a person through the lens that they have defined. You cannot cite Marx to try and convince the courts of the wisdom of the downfall of capitalism. It's not going to work. If anything, that's just ammunition that they can use against you. So you have to be flexible in your ideology. You have to read the room, understand when you should be citing Marx and when you should be citing revolutionary theory and when you should be talking about more practical methods that make sense to the common person. But yeah, I think that's arguably one of the biggest mistakes that they had. But it's also hard to ignore certain truths as to why American communists thought this way. So a lot of you are probably wondering, what do you mean, Josh, that the communists thought fascism was coming to the United States? Why would they believe this? Why would they be so delusional? There are things that contribute to it. The KKK after 1945 had spread out of the South. They had started riots in Detroit, they had started riots in Chicago, and they were very much beginning to dominate the radical right segment of the Midwest. You had race riots breaking out almost every 6 months from 1945 to 1949. The Jim Crow laws were being upheld by state Supreme Courts all throughout this period, right up to the point where the NAACP manages to get the challenge for the Kansas school system into the Supreme Court by 1952. You also had CPUSA members indicted in large numbers. We're talking thousands of state and district members just being rounded up by the FBI and being charged with the Smith Act. So it was probably an era that certainly felt like fascism. It probably genuinely felt like the government was trying to purge its society of communists. Now, were they doing what the Nazis did and taking the communists and throwing them into gas chambers or just executing them in the street? No. So they were not doing the kind of purge that fascists were doing. They were doing the kind of purge that is logical for a capitalist society with a court system that has to be upheld by the support of the people. If the people, for whatever reason, decide we don't like this court system anymore, then the court system is going to have a problem. So the court has to do things in a manner that seem palpable and seem logical to an extent. So they're not going to round people up. They're not going to execute people in the street, but it's the process of taking people because they are communists that I think gives fuel to the fire that is fascism is in America, etc. As irrational as it can seem to us, hindsight is 2020. And in the moment, seeing the rise of the KKK, the defense of Jim Crow laws, the inability to get the Supreme Court to say anything about the Jim Crow laws until 1952, and then the execution of the Rosenbergs in 1952-53. These things probably seemed like it was very, very scary to be a communist. So can I understand what communists meant in their knee-jerk reaction of fascism is in America? Yes, I can certainly understand it, but I can also acknowledge that it was a mistake. They should have thought more about it, and they should have listened to their lawyers when their lawyers said we should be citing the First Amendment and the Fifth Amendment, etc.
Yeah, and again, we don't have a ton of time left, but I think that's a really important point, and I'm going to talk about it just a little bit. I think that's particularly relevant these days. Again, the resurgence of these fascist autocrats, and that discussion of like what fascism is and isn't, and I think a lot of people, worth understanding. A lot of people pointed out historically that. The Nazi Germany, in a lot of ways, was copying America's homework, its colonial projects, and further on neo-colonial projects. And I would also recommend folks, it's critical to understand how fascism can grow out of the American system, especially today. Something I recommend people check out: George Jackson's "Blood in My Eye." You don't have to agree with his thesis on American fascism, but it kind of illuminates where those threads come from. And I'd even say maybe like read after that. Angela Davis talks about that in her autobiography, is kind of disagreeing. It's like, no, we do have to have a hard line in the sand between, yeah, kind of the racist capitalist state in America and like capital F fascism. So, again, that's something that we need to really think about, especially in these times. But yeah, I think you're right. There's that distinction is really important, and it can kind of lead to some pratfalls. But again, I think
To quickly add on to your book list there, Charles Higham's American Swastika is another great look at the German American Bund and how they certainly contribute to this idea of how quick fascism can come to the United States, because they go from being like just a relatively language speaking federation to members of like 100-something thousand by 1940. So yeah, that's another book to check out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're kind of at the end of our conversation here. And I guess I just want to ask real quick, and I think we've kind of gone over some of this in the course of our conversation, but what are you hoping are some of the key lessons that American leftists and communists should take from your book, from this history? And like looking at what our predecessors did right, what our predecessors did wrong. And one thing that comes up to mind to me is I think modern the modern America, pan-socialist left in America has a much better conception of colonialism than they did back in the day. Granted, we do not have a lot of the institutions that they had to rely on back then, necessarily because a lot of them were smashed by capitalism. But just kind of figuring out what are some of those key lessons you hope people take from your book.
Yeah, I mean, we did kind of one of the key lessons I did mention before, which is to understand that revolutionary movements are messy and that they're made up of people who come up from a multitude of backgrounds. But I also think that it's important that, and hopefully people get this from my book. I guess it could be misleading, but that being part of a social movement like this and to be successful in involves sacrifices that go above and beyond what you probably sacrifice for your friends, your family, and your job. It probably requires you to sacrifice more for people you don't know and in some cases disagree with ideologically than you sacrifice for your close family. It's hard for people to wrap their mind around that. But you read these autobiographies of like Hosea Hudson and how he spent 6 weeks trying to build a sharecropping union in Alabama, while also at the same time outrunning authorities and escaping the Ku Klux Klan. Like, I mean, these people chose dangerous lives. At some cases, lives that did not have any necessary direction or possibility of a guarantee for success. It involved a massive risk, but their commitment to the ideology is what made the risk worth taking. And also important to consider this, if you think of yourself as an activist or a revolutionary today, you need to grapple with the reality that being involved in a revolutionary movement means it's going to involve associating with people that you may not like, or in some cases may hate. It's going to involve compromising when the very task of compromising seems impossible because of differences of opinion. You're going to come across this roadblock where it's going to be like, we're at an impasse and the only option is to compromise or sectarianism. And you're going to have to grapple with that. It also involves fortitude and the ability to kind of stick to theory when necessary, but also be adaptive and willing to also be somewhat flexible. Kind of like what I said before, read the room, know when it's necessary to be flexible, but also know when it's necessary to stand your ground. But most of all, just try and accept that a revolutionary movement cannot be led by one particular idea. An idea can push the movement into actually momentum, giving it momentum, but it cannot and it should not lead it through success. Ideas have to change as the situation changes. And if we are unwilling to acknowledge that truth, then I think the left is going to continue to succumb to left sectarianism and right opportunism, which is preventing the left from being a cohesive whole. You're going to continue to have people appeal to mainstream centrist groups. And then you're going to continue to have people who say, because people are appealing to the center, I'm going to be on the extreme far left. That's what's preventing the glue from bringing that all together.
All right, Josh, again, I want to thank you so much for your time. Again, I'm a big fan of the book and I'm going to be recommending it to a lot of people. How would people find your book? So I mentioned I found it like early PDF. Is there who's publishing it? Is there can people get a hard copy? Maybe I'm asking a little bit for myself now, but
Yeah, you can
would
get a
people get
hard
your book?
copy. I would recommend not trying to go look for it if you're pinched on money, because it is a little bit on the expensive side. However, you can get a digital copy for about $45, I believe, from Amazon. And I'm trying really hard to get enough of the digital copies sold so that we can get a paperback edition. And if we can get a paperback edition out, I think that will improve the readership of it significantly. It's by Lexington Publishers. They're a subfield of Rowman and Littlefield. They specialize more in like revolutionary radical history. and you can find it at like Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all that sort of stuff. I would recommend that you try and avoid corporate entities. Like go to your local bookstore and just ask for them to order it, because you can get it direct from Lexington if you want. Just go to Lexington's website and order it from there. But yeah, I am hoping that the readership becomes more widely available so that people can get a paperback copy. But the digital copy, is pretty easy to obtain.
Okay, so we only have 2 minutes, but I did say at the top, like recommended follow-up reading for people who come across
Ah,
the book.
yes. Okay. Recommended follow-up reading. Let's see. We've got Eugene Dennis's autobiography, Ideas They Cannot Jail. We've got Communist Councilman from Harlem, the autobiography of Benjamin Davis, who fought in the Scottsboro and Angelo Herndon trials. We've got Trotskyists on Trial by Donna Stack, which is a great book about the Smith Act being used on the Trotskyist, The Narrative of Hosea Hudson, which is edited by Nell Irving Painter, very famous American historian. It would be impossible to not talk about one of the newest additions to American communist history by Kate Weingard, Red Feminism, in which she very much shows how women played a crucial aspect of the cultural and community dimensions of American communism. And then lastly, I would, of course, recommend people take a look at Beatrice Lumpkin's autobiography, Joy in the Struggle, and then John Gates's autobiography about participating in the Abraham Lincoln Brigades and World War II.
All right, Josh, thank you so much for your time. We'll link to all those recommendations in the show notes. Again, thank you so much for taking time to talk to us on the program. And again, really excellent book. Going to be recommending it out to most of my fellow leftists from here on out.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, and I'm glad that you enjoyed it, and hopefully more people enjoy it as well.